Hey guys, Pavel here, and today I would like to talk about destructing assignment. If you have background in languages like C++, you may think of this as a destructor. Well, it's nothing like that. However, the name is very close to what it actually does. Destructing assignment can be used to unpack object properties or array items to distinct variables using a shorthand notation. To illustrate, let's define an array that has some items in it. I'm gonna define an array that has, that is an array that equals 1, 2, 3, and 4, and that's array items. Now we can create distinct variables of these items. Const first and second equals array. Easy. Now first and second variables have values of 1 and 2 respectively. Worth to mention that the actual source object did not change when destructing assignment was used. It only creates new variables from the source object. Now we can combine destructing assignment with REST parameters. You will find a link to a video about REST parameters in the description. Let's update our code to be like still first, then second, and then we're gonna use the REST assignment. Now the first and second variables are still having the same 1 and 2 values respectively. The REST variable, however, is an array with the REST, meaning not assign items from the array, which is 3 and 4. Similarly with objects, we can have an object that has some properties. I'm gonna define a property, an object which is a const me that equals, and there's an object. First is Pavel, and last is Sztyć. I can now destruct or unpack this object into distinct variables. These variables, however, need to be called the same as the properties in the object. I can do something like const first and last equals me. Now the first variable has value Pavel and the last variable has Sztyć value. This is something you may use very often in your application. Most common use is when a class or a function accepts a configuration object as an argument instead of a list of arguments. It is specifically useful when the arguments are optional. You don't want to define such arguments as it may produce some weird use of a function like say function with some required argument, have some null value, and then has some optional argument. We don't like this in programming. It's hard to read and use. Java developers may disagree with me, but we are talking about web programming. To avoid such a situation, you should put all optional arguments into a single argument and destruct it in the function body. So our function would be required parameter, and then some options. We can even assign a default value, which is empty object. Open the function body and close it. And now we can destruct our arguments. Const, let's say we have argument first and last from options. Another use case is a shallow copy of an object or an array. As I mentioned before, it does not affect the source object, but it creates variables from the values. With combination with arrays parameters, it is very easy to create a shallow copy of an object. To illustrate, let's create a source. So now we have a source object, and now we're gonna create a shallow copy of the source object. And this is rest parameter. This assignment copies properties from one object to another. Remember, however, it is a shallow copy. This means that if a property is an object or an array, the value of it is not copied but rather passed as a reference. Deep changes in the copy object would change the source object as well. To illustrate how this would work, let me change my example right now. I'm gonna add a property that is an object. Let's say it's a deep. That is an object that has property a that equals 1. And now we are creating a copy of the object. Now, if I change the deep value of a copy object, copy dot deep dot a equals 2. Unfortunately, in this case, the source dot deep dot a equals 2 as well. To create a deep copy of an object, you would have to use some other method that recursively creates a copy of an object or arrays. I won't be explaining this issue here, as this is a topic for an entire video. Similarly, with arrays, you can use a destruction assignment to create a new array. It is equivalent to calling a slice method on an array without an argument. To illustrate, let's change our source, which is now an array with values 1, 2, 3, 4 again. And we are creating a copy. That is copy. And using rest argument. The same principle. It only creates a shallow copy of an array. Complex items are passed by reference and not copied. Speaking of values, the destructing assignment can be combined with default values for both arrays and objects. This way you can create a function that accepts a configuration object and defines default values when destructing the object. To illustrate, let's create a function called, let's say, fn that has options that equals to some default empty object. And now I can destruct this object to say param1 that equals, say, 1 options. This way I can call this function like just function without any parameter, and it will work because all parameters, default parameters, are defined. But what happens when you already have a variable with the same name in the current scope as the one in the property of a destructed object? Say you have a constant with some value and the same name is in an object. To illustrate, say you have const a that has some value, and we're gonna create a source object that has a property that has some other value. Now to destruct the a property, you'll have to do something like a equals source. However, This code would result in error as the constant a is already defined. In this case, you can use colon after property name when destructing the object to change the name of the declared variable. So to illustrate, it is a, let's call it other, that equals source. And at this point, we have three variables defined in the scope. It's a, its source, and its other. Finally, you can use destructing assignment in the arguments list. To illustrate, again, function fn, and we can already open an object using the destructing assignment. Prop1, say prop2, and defaults to empty object, and some body declaration. In this function, the argument is optional, defaults to empty object, and has two properties. It makes function declaration and the usage so much easier, especially when all or some arguments are optional. That's it for now. If you like this video, please subscribe to see more content like this. See you next time, and thanks for watching.